The Mistress of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe, Volume 1, Chapter 2. I could a tale unfold whose lightest word would harrow up thy soul. Shakespeare. Madame St. Herbert was interred in the neighboring village church. Her husband and daughter attended her to the grave, followed by a long train of peasantry, who were sincere mourners of this excellent woman. On his return from the funeral, St. Herbert shut himself in his chamber. When he came forth, it was with a sincere countenance, though pale in sorrow. He gave orders that his family should attend him. Emily only was absent, who, overcome with the scene she had just witnessed, had retired to her closet to weep alone. St. Herbert followed her thither. He took her hand in silence while she continued to weep, and it was some moments before he could so far command his voice as to speak. I trembled while he said, "My Emily, I am going to prayers with my family. You will join us. We must ask support from above. Where else ought we to seek it? Where else can we find it?" Emily checked her tears, and followed her father to the parlour where, the servants being assembled, St. Herbert read, in a low and solemn voice, the evening service, and added a prayer for the soul of the departed. During this his voice often faltered, his tears fell upon the book, and at length he paused. But the sublime emotions of pure devotion gradually elevated his views above this world, and finally brought comfort to his heart. When the service was ended, and the servants were withdrawn, he tenderly kissed Emily, and said, "I have endeavoured to teach you from your earliest youth the duty of self-command. I have pointed out to you the great importance of it through life, not only as it preserves us in the various and dangerous temptations that call us from rectitude and virtue, but as it limits the indulgences which are termed virtues, yet which, extended beyond a certain boundary, are vicious, for their consequences is evil. All excess is vicious, even that sorrow, which is amiable in its origin, becomes a selfish and unjust passion if indulged at the expense of our duties. By our duties I mean what we owe to ourselves as well as to others. The indulgence of excessive grief enervates the mind, and almost incapacitates it for again partaking of those various innocent enjoyments which a benevolent God designed to be the sunshine of our lives. My dear Emily, recollect and practice the precepts I have so often given you, and which your own experience has so often shown you to be wise. Your sorrow is useless. Do not receive this as merely a commonplace remark, but let reason therefore restrain sorrow. I would not annihilate your feelings, my child. I would not teach you to command them, for whatever may be the evils resulting from a too susceptible heart, nothing can be hoped from the insensible one. that, on the other hand, is all vice, vice of which the deformity is not softened, or the effect consoled for by any semblance or possibility of good. You know my sufferings, and are therefore convinced that mine are not the light words which on these occasions are so often repeated to destroy even the sources of honest emotion, or which merely display the selfish ostentation of a false philosophy. I will shew my Emily that I can practice what I advise. I have said thus much because I cannot bear to see you wasting in useless sorrow for want of that resistance which is due from mind, and I have not said it till now, because there is a period when all reasoning must yield to nature, that is past, and another when excessive indulgence, having sunk into habit, weighs down the elasticity of the spirits, so as to render conquest nearly impossible. This is to come. You, my Emily, will shew that you are willing to avoid it. Emily smiled through her tears upon her father. "Dear sir," said she, and her voice trembled. She would have added, "I will shew myself worthy of being your daughter," but a mingled emotion of gratitude, affection, and grief overcame her. Saint Herbert suffered her to weep without interruption, and then began to talk on common topics. The first person who came to condole with Saint Herbert was Baruch, an austere and seemingly unfeeling man. A taste for botany had introduced them to each other, for they had frequently met in their wanderings among the mountains. Baruch had retired from the world, and almost from society, to live in a pleasant chateau on the skirts of the woods near La Vallée. He also had been disappointed in his opinion of mankind, but he did not, like St. Herbert, pity and mourn for them. He felt more indignation at their voices. He felt more indignation at their vices than compassion for their weaknesses. St. Herbert was somewhat surprised to see him, for though he had often pressed him to come to the chateau, he had never till now accepted the invitation, and now he came without ceremony or reserve, entering the parlour as an old friend. The claims of misfortune appeared to have softened down all the ruggedness and prejudices of his heart. St. Herbert, unhappy, seemed to be the sole idea that occupied his mind. It was in manners more than in words that he appeared to sympathize with his friends. He spoke little on the subject of their grief, but the minute attention he gave them, and the modulated voice and softened look that accompanied it came from his heart and spoke to theirs. At this melancholy period, St. Herbert was likewise visited by Madame Guerin, his only surviving sister, who had been some years a widow, and now resided on her own estate near Toulouse. The intercourse between them had not been very frequent. In her condolements words were not wanting. She understood not the magic of the look that speaks at once to the soul, or the voice that sings like balm to the heart. But she assured St. Herbert that she sincerely sympathized with him, praised the virtues of his late wife, and then offered what she considered to be consolation. Emily wept unceasingly while she spoke. St. Herbert was tranquil, listened to what she said in silence, and then turned the discourse upon another subject. At parting she pressed him and her niece to make her an early visit. "Change of place will amuse you," said she, "and it is wrong to give way to grief." St. Herbert acknowledged the truth of these words of course, but at the same time felt more reluctant than ever to quit the spot which his past happiness had consecrated. The presence of his wife had sanctified every surrounding scene, and each day, as it gradually softened the acuteness of his suffering, assisted the tender enchantment that bound him to home. But there were calls which must be complied with, and of this kind was the visit he paid to his brother-in-law M. Quesnel. An affair of an interesting nature made it necessary that he should delay this visit no longer, and wishing to rouse Emily from her dejection, he took her with him to Eporville. As the carriage entered upon the forest that adjoined his paternal domain, his eyes once more caught, between the chestnut avenue, the turreted corners of the chateau. He sighed to think of what had passed since he was last there, and that it was now the property of a man who neither devoured nor valued it. At length he entered the avenue, whose lofty trees had so often delighted him when a boy, and whose melancholy shade was now so congenial with the tone of his spirits. Every feature of the edifice, distinguished by an air of heavy grandeur, appeared successively between the branches of the trees. The broad turret, the arched gateway that led into the courts, the drawbridge, and the dry fosse which surrounded the whole. The sound of carriage wheels brought a troop of servants to the great gate, where St. Herbert alighted, and from which he led Emily into the Gothic hall, now no longer hung with the arms and ancient banners of the family. These were displaced, and the oak wainscoting and beams that crossed the roof were painted white. The large table, too, that used to stretch along the upper end of the hall, where the master of the mansion loved to display his hospitality, and whence the peal of laughter and the song of conviviality had so often resounded, was now removed. Even the benches that had surrounded the hall were no longer there. The heavy walls were hung with frivolous ornaments, and everything that appeared denoted the false taste and corrupted sentiments of the present owner. St. Herbert followed a gay Parisian servant to a parlour where sat Mons and Madame Quesnel, who received him with a stately politeness and after a few formal words of condolence, seemed to have forgotten that they ever had a sister. Emily felt tears swell into her eyes, and then resentment checked them. Saint Aubert, calm and deliberate, preserved his dignity without assuming importance, and Quesnel was depressed by his presence without exactly knowing wherefore. After some general conversation, Saint Aubert requested to speak with him alone, and Emily, being left with Madame Quesnel, soon learned that a large party was invited to dine at the chateau, and was compelled to hear that nothing which was past and irremediable ought to prevent the festivity of the present hour. Saint Aubert, when he was told that company were expected, felt a mixed emotion of disgust and indignation against the insensibility of Quesnel, which prompted him to return home immediately. But he was informed that Madame Cheron had been asked to meet him, and when he looked at Emily, and considered that a time might come when the enmity of her uncle would be prejudicial to her, he determined not to incur it himself by conduct which would be resented as indecorous by the very persons who now shewed so little sense of decorum. Among the visitors assembled at dinner were two Italian gentlemen, of whom one was named Montoni, a distant relation of Madame Quesnel, a man about 40, of an uncommonly handsome person, with features manly and expressive, but whose countenance exhibited upon the whole more of the haughtiness of command and the quickness of discernment than of any other character. Signor Cavigni, his friend, appeared to be about 30, his inferior in dignity, but equal to him in penetration of countenance, and superior in insinuation of manner. Emily was shocked by the salutation with which Madame Cheron met her father. "Dear brother," said she, "I am concerned to see you look so very ill. Do pray have advice." St. Aubert answered with a melancholy smile that he felt himself much as usual. But Emily's fears made her now fancy that her father looked worse than he really did. Emily would have been amused by the new characters she saw, and the varied conversation that passed during dinner, which was served in a style of splendour she had seldom seen before, had her spirits been less oppressed. Of the guests, Signor Montoni was lately come from Italy, and he spoke of the commotions which at that period agitated the country, talked of partly differences with warmth, and then lamented the probable consequences of the tumult. His friend spoke with equal ardour of the politics of his country, praised the government and prosperity of Venice, and boasted of its decided superiority over all the other Italian states. He then overturned to the ladies, and talked with the same eloquence of Parisian fashions, the French opera, and French manners, and on the latter subject he did not fail to mingle what is so particularly agreeable to French taste. The flattery was not detected by those whom it was addressed, though its effect in producing submissive attention did not escape his observation. When he could disengage himself from the assiduities of the other ladies, he sometimes addressed Emily, but she knew nothing of Parisian fashions or Parisian operas, and her modesty, simplicity, and correct manners formed a decided contrast to those of her female companions. After dinner St. Aubert stole from the room to view once more the old chestnut which Quesnel talked of cutting down. As he stood under its shade and looked up among its branches, still luxuriant, and saw here and there the blue sky trembling between them, the pursuits and events of his early days crowded fast to his mind, with the figures and characters of friends long since gone from the earth, and he now felt himself to be almost an insulated being, with nobody but his Emily for his heart to turn to. He stood lost amid the scenes of years which fancy called up, till the succession closed with the picture of his dying wife, and he started away to forget it, if possible, at the social board. St. Aubert ordered his carriage at an early hour, and Emily observed that he was more than usually silent and dejected on the way home, but she considered this to be the effect of his visit to a place which spoke so eloquently of former times, not suspected that he had a cause of grief which he concealed from her. On entering the chateau she felt more depressed than ever, for she more than ever missed the presence of that dear parent who, whenever she had been from home, used to welcome her return with smiles and fondness. Now all was silent and forsaken. But what reason and effort may fail to do, time effects. Week after week passed away, and each as it passed stole something from the harshness of her affliction, till it was mellowed to that tenderness which the feeling heart cherishes as sacred. St. Aubert, on the contrary, visibly declined in health, though Emily, who had been so constantly with him, was almost the last person who observed it. His constitution had never recovered from the late attack of the fever, and the succeeding shock it received from Madame St. Aubert's death had produced its present infirmity. His physician now ordered him to travel, for it was perceptible that sorrow had seized upon his nerves, weakened as they had been by the preceding illness and variety of scene. It was probable would, by assuming his mind, restore them to their proper tone. For some days Emily was occupied in preparations to attend him, and he by endeavours to diminish his expenses at home during the journey, a purpose which determined him at length to dismiss his domestics. Emily seldom opposed her father's wishes by questions or remonstrances, or she would now have asked why he did not take a servant, and have represented that his infirm health made one almost necessary. But when, on the eve of their departure, she found that he had dismissed Jacques, Francis, and Mary, and detained only Teresa, the old housekeeper, she was extremely surprised, and ventured to ask his reason for having done so. "To save expenses, my dear," he replied. "We are going on an expensive excursion." The physician had prescribed the air of Languedoc and Provence, and St. Aubert determined therefore to travel leisurely along the shores of the Mediterranean towards Provence. They retired early to their chamber on the night before their departure, but Emily had a few books and other things to collect, and the clock had struck 12 before she had finished, or had remembered that some of her drawing instruments, which she meant to take with her, were in the parlour below. As she went to fetch these, she passed her father's room, and perceiving the door half open, concluded that he was in his study, for since the death of Madame St. Aubert it had been frequently his custom to rise from his restless bed and go thither to compose his mind. When she was below stairs she looked into this room, but without finding him, and as she returned to her chamber she tapped at his door, and receiving no answer stepped softly in to be certain whether he was there. The room was dark, but a light glimmered through some panes of glass that were placed in the upper part of the closet door. Emily believed her father to be in the closet, and surprised that he was up at so late an hour, apprehended he was unwell, and was going to inquire. But considering that her sudden appearance at this hour might alarm him, she removed her light to the staircase, and then stepped softly to the closet. On looking through the panes of glass, she saw him seated at a small table, with papers before him, some of which he was reading with deep attention and interest, during which he often wept and sobbed aloud. Emily, who had come to the door to learn whether her father was ill, was now detained there by a mixture of curiosity and tenderness. She could not witness his sorrow without being anxious to know the subject of it, and she therefore continued to observe him in silence, concluding that those papers were letters of her late mother. Presently he knelt down, and with a look so solemn as she had seldom seen him assume, and which was mingled with a certain wild expression that partook more of horror than of any other character, he prayed silently for a considerable time. When he rose, a ghastly paleness was on his countenance. Emily was hastily retiring, but she saw him turning again to the papers, and she stopped. He took from among them a small case, and from thence a miniature picture. The rays of light fell strongly upon it, and she perceived it to be that of a lady, but not of her mother. St. Aubert gazed earnestly and tenderly upon this portrait, put it to his lips, and then to his heart, and sighed with a convulsive force. Emily could scarcely believe what she saw to be real. She never knew till now that he had a picture of any other lady than her mother, much less that he had one which he evidently valued so highly. But having looked repeatedly to be certain that it was not the resemblance of Madame St. Aubert, she became entirely convinced that it was designed for that of some other person. At length St. Aubert returned the picture into its case, and Emily, recollecting that she was intruding upon his private sorrows, softly withdrew from the chamber.